Not long after, Roland returned to the castle and immediately called over the heads of several departments of the city hall. Under the astonished gazes of those present, it was their first time seeing the tentacle creatures, aka the ancient Takira witches. Despite having been forewarned, the sight of these tentacle creatures made everyone gasp in shock. Some spilled their tea, some stood up, and some even thought of leaving the hall. Edith was the only one who could be considered calm. There was a mix of excitement and curiosity in her eyes, and Roland also noticed the way Edith looked at him was a bit weird. He had no idea why her face was blushing, perhaps excited seeing tentacles. Nonetheless, he shook off the thoughts. Given the upcoming battle against demons, Roland naturally had to inform everyone of the Takira witches' existence. He then began to introduce their origin and their stories. It seemed like, after more than 2 years of experience, all of Roland's officials and their ability to accept new things should have greatly improved. As he thought. But just as Roland finished explaining and shared the plan to explore the snowy mountains, Powerf was the first to speak up. His finance department was entering the year-end closing stage, making it inconvenient to plan new logistics. He also pointed out that with the month of the demons not over yet, and a portion of the first army currently stationed in the far south, sending troops to the snowy mountains could lead to insufficient defensive forces in the borders. Carter was second to speak. Oh lord, this is our handsome chief knight Carter. The new artist surely did him dirty. Anyway, he expressed his concerns about the plan's reliability. Clearly, he held some skepticism against the Takira witches. The agriculture minister then spoke and mentioned that mobilizing now could strain their food reserves. The minister of construction, Carl, worried that the Takira witches' excavations at the foot of the northern mountains could destabilize the mines and cause collapses. Everyone expressed their concerns, which all boiled down to advising Roland to reconsider his plan. This left Roland somewhat disappointed, as it seemed like his plan would be hard to continue if it were up to a council discussion. Although Roland usually prefers a democratic approach, however, on certain matters, he doesn't forget that he is the ultimate decision-maker. In times like these, it was up to him to assertively push forward the implementation of the plan. Just as he decisively decided to shelter the witches years ago. Roland tapped the table, and the hall instantly fell silent. He declared that the next year would be the most important year for Grey Castle, as he intended to unify the entire territory and hold a coronation ceremony to officially become the king of Grey Castle. He tells them that everyone present here would become his first cabinet ministers, assisting him in governing the kingdom. Upon hearing this, everyone stood up, placed their right hand over their chest.
Like Roblox, the sandbox allows you to build your own 3D games using its Game Maker application.
Their right hand over their chest, bowed in respect, and finally understood their king's intentions. They stopped complaining, and the fear they once had about the demons and Takira witches had dissipated completely. To everyone here, for they knew their king had always led them to victory, and have never been wrong. To even have the thought of hindering the king's plan because of their own fear is embarrassing. After a moment, the discussion resumed. Carter suggested that they should only send the first army in the Witch Union into the snowy mountains first. Roland interrupted him, pointing out the absence of light and the complexity of the terrain, which would render firearms ineffective. Witch Union into the snowy mountains first. Roland interrupted him, pointing out the absence of light and the complexity of the terrain, which would render firearms ineffective. Encountering powerful mixed-breed demonic beasts in close range would undoubtedly lead to heavy casualties for the first army. Carter was left speechless. He totally didn't think of this. Roland continued, explaining that this was precisely why they needed to collaborate with the Takira witches on the exploration. The gods' punishment witches and the Witch Union could complement each other perfectly. The first army would be responsible for covering their rear and establishing outposts that explored passageways to ensure a clear retreat path. Roland emphasized that this was the most prudent approach. However, Roland paused, then raised his voice to make sure everyone understood. He did not want to hear about how difficult implementing this plan would be because everyone here was sitting there precisely to solve these difficulties. At this point, Roland's demeanor became serious. With the Third Divine War looming, he emphasized the need for capable ministers and officials. He then turned to Powerf, who stood up abruptly, visibly startled. When asked if there were any issues with the financial settlements and logistics, Powerf claimed he could have a plan ready in 5 days. Roland, however, shook his head and gave him only 3 days. He then directed the Minister of Agriculture to ensure the food supply was prepared, and if it wasn't sufficient, he tells him to send ships to Changgu district to acquire more. Addressing Carl, before Roland even said anything, he proactively assured he would thoroughly inspect the geological stability of the mining areas and furnaces to prevent collapses. Roland nodded in approval and proceeded to assign tasks to everyone else. After discussing the plan, Roland asked Edith to recap the arrangements. Edith stood up. For this mission, Takira would dispatch 50 gods punishment witches to fight alongside the Witch Union. The first army, under the command of Brian, would select 500 of their best soldiers, while the rest would remain stationed in Neverwinter under Carter's command. With consensus reached on the exploration plan, Roland was about to conclude the meeting when Edith stood up, requesting to join the expedition to the snowy mountains. Barra, sitting next to him, remarked that she was neither a witch nor a soldier. She didn't need to be on the mission. However, Edith countered by stating she was a knight and had served as a swordsmanship instructor, capable of defending herself. Roland inquired about her reason for applying. Edith believed that with the Divine War drawing closer, most of the ministers probably didn't even know what demons looked like. If one did not even know the enemy, it would be impossible to assist the king in managing the city hall effectively. She thinks that with the Great War approaching, everyone needed to prepare for battle. Powerf wanted to object but found himself at a loss for words. Clearly everything Edith said was right. Roland smiled, finding the argument interesting. Suddenly, he had an idea. What if this became a standard rule, where advancement for power required frontline experience as a prerequisite for promotion? This could ensure that city hall officials would not underestimate their enemy and the war. Moreover, Edith possesses a talent for combat. With this in mind, Roland agreed to Edith's proposal. Edith played with her hair, smiling and bowing in gratitude. Back at the apartment, Cole watched his sister, Edith, pack her bags. She mentioned she would be away for a few days, and Cole observed the pile of clothes on the bed, realizing they were not meant for visiting nobility or attending dinners. Edith praised Cole for his observation with a smile. However, turning serious, she advised Cole to always maintain elegance when in the company of ladies, causing him to shiver. Edith then inquired about Cole's experience working at the city hall. Cole, who had not revealed his identity, said he diligently did his job, though he wondered why his sister hadn't arranged for him to work in her department. Edith smiled, explaining that the city hall wasn't as straightforward as it seemed, and with Minister Powerf closely monitoring her, she couldn't afford to be seen as biased, especially since they represented their family. Cole bowed his head, thoughtful. After a moment, he nodded seriously, assuring her he would be mindful of this. Seeing her little brother had been more mature, she also remembered what their father once said. Cole's timid nature and lack of combat strength made him unsuitable to lead the family. However, in the city of Neverwinter, her little brother wouldn't need to act as a lord defending their territory with knights or fight in the front line when there's a battle. Cole would surely find his own significance in the city of Neverwinter. Casually picking up a long dress and holding it up to himself, Cole was especially eager to know where Edith was headed. Edith informed him that the mission was confidential and that knowing more would come at a cost. Cole thought this was a joke, and continued to wanting to know. With a smirk, Edith revealed they were heading to the snowy mountains in the western region to explore alongside the First Army and Witch Union. Cole, curious, asked why they needed to explore there. Edith calmly mentioned unknown hybrid monsters or a different civilization. Encountering anything would not be surprising, including the king's new alliance with tentacled creatures. Cole's jaw dropped in shock, unable to comprehend how his sister was not frightened by such terrifying prospects or how tentacled creatures could become allies of the king. For a moment, Cole thought his sister had lost her mind. Edith shifted the topic while asking if Cole remembered why they had pledged allegiance to the king. Cole responded it was for greater power. Edith noted his answer wasn't entirely accurate but wasn't wrong either. Power comes from vast lands and people. Once His Majesty defeated all of the civilizations, even the demons, then the power they could share would extend beyond human territories. Cole stood still, taking a while to digest this information. Nonetheless, pointing to the long dress then tells him to wear it, she tells Cole it's time to pay the price. While, in the southern territory, Lorca gazed across the vast desert, unsure of her exact location, however, she could hear strange sounds beneath her feet. Suddenly, a massive sandworm emerged from beneath the ground, its appearance fierce and terrifying. Before the sandworm stood a young girl who seemed to appear out of nowhere, facing the giant sandworm. She didn't seem afraid. Turned out, she jumped high and struck the sandworm's head with a punch before piercing its skull with a spear. Lorca watched in disbelief. The girl was no other than her younger self. She remembered clearly, at just 12 years old, she had completed her first hunt, discovering a love for the thrill of combat. Her second hunt was against a giant scorpion, which Lorca defeated with ease, severing its tail and then its head. The third time, this time, she was facing dozens of desert wolves. Nonetheless, she was still fearless, engaging them with dual blades. However, luck was not on her side this time, and she was eventually overwhelmed by the pack. Just as she thought she would meet her end there, she awakened her goddess power, transforming into a red wolf. Side this time, and she was eventually was facing dozens of desert wolves. Nonetheless, she was still fearless, engaging them with dual blades. However, luck was not on her side this time, and she was eventually overwhelmed by the pack. Just as she thought she would meet her end there, she awakened her goddess power, transforming into a red wolf. The excruciating pain of the transformation awakened her powers. Standing amidst the bloodstained sands, she looked down upon the wolves, which all submitted before her gaze, bowing with their heads low. Soon, she faced her ultimate foe, an eagle-like demonic beast. Lorca charged at the beast in the sky, the two massive creatures clashing with blood and feathers scattering in the air. She wished for a second chance, but the opportunity would not come. The scene slowly shifts away from her. Fear gripped her heart, causing her to tremble. She refused to spend the rest of her life lying in bed and became useless. She wanted to stand up and continue fighting. Lorca abruptly opened her eyes, sitting up straight. Cold sweat soaked her back in the bedsheet. Hearing the scream, a maid rushed in and began to wipe the cold sweat from her body. Lorca looked around in disbelief. Her hands, eyes, and even her feet had no issues, and she felt no pain anywhere on her body. She rolled out of bed and stood firmly on the ground. Puzzled, she looked at the maid, who explained that people from the north had brought a new goddess who had healed her. The young goddess hadn't used any herbs, yet Lorca was miraculously healed. Remembering the words Ashes had said to her, it seemed that what she said wasn't merely words of comfort. She hurriedly dressed, ready to go out and express her gratitude, but the maid informed her that they had already left. The Asha clan had traveled to Grey Castle with the first group of sand people 2 days earlier, and Ashes and the others had left with them. Feeling a bit lost, Lorca then asked how long she had been unconscious. The maid showed 3 fingers and then added another 3. Lorca looked back at the bed she had just lain in, realizing she had had a very long dream over these 6 days. She then inquired about recent events and learned that the previous second clan had absorbed the severely weakened Blackwater clan before issuing a sacred duel to her own clan. However, her father, the chief, conceded defeat immediately, and as a result, their clan had fallen to 3rd place. This also meant they would have to leave the castle. Without saying much, Lorca stormed out to find her father. The maid hurriedly picked up her hood, but Lorca touched her ears and tail, smiling and saying she no longer needed a hood. As she walked out, she remembered her father's advice to hide her features as much as possible, but Lorca had finally found what she really wanted. On her way, she saw many clan members carrying their belongings back and forth, clearly reluctant and saddened by leaving the fortress. Soon, she arrived at her father's castle. The guards were delighted to see their princess. Lorca smiled and asked if her father was inside, and the guard nodded, hesitating but then mentioned there were other people inside too. Standing outside, Lorca could clearly hear the arguments inside. It seemed like there was a dispute between her brother and another party, who not only failed to honor their agreement to give them enough time but also insulted their clan. Walking inside, she saw her brother had drawn his weapon against them, followed by the sounds of swords being unsheathed. Her father, in a low voice, ordered everyone to sheath their weapons. Looking towards the door, he was pleased to see his daughter. Her brother's eyes widened in disbelief at the sight of his sister, his expression a mix of shock and surprise. The other party was also in disbelief. Many had witnessed Lorca had broken all of her bones on the stage. It seemed impossible for her to stand up, let alone be able to walk. They also noticed the ears on her head and the tail behind her. The man gulped hard, losing his earlier composure and stepping back a few steps, telling her that regardless, Lorca's clan had already admitted defeat, and if they wanted to challenge again, they would have to wait 6 months. Lorca calmly stated they would respect the outcome, then asked who Kabucha was. The person who had been speaking pointed to himself, admitting it was him, and then urged Lorca and her clan to hurry and leave. Without giving him another chance to speak, Lorca punched him in the jaw, sending him flying. As this was his punishment for disrespecting her father earlier. Everyone was stunned, but no one dared to approach. Lorca glared at them, declaring that even though their clan had fallen to 3rd place, the dignity of their chief was not to be violated. She then ordered them all to GTFO. The few quickly carried the unconscious Kabucha and ran out, not daring to say another word. Seeing the enemy leave, Lorca's brother immediately turned to their father, suggesting that since Lorca was unharmed, they could return here in 6 months. He also proposed that their father negotiate with the other clan's chief, arguing that since they were going to lose anyway, it might be better to maintain the status quo. The other guards seemed excited, agreeing with the prince's suggestion. The chief, however, did not respond but looked at Lorca, wanting to hear her thoughts. Lorca glanced at the guards and then at her brother. Biting her lip, she finally let out a sigh, revealing that she had come to say goodbye. When everyone heard that Lorca intended to leave, they were stunned. Her brother was the first to speak, asking about their clan's future and how they would handle future sacred duels. Lorca did not answer but silently looked at her father. The chief paused for a moment and then gestured for everyone to leave, wanting to speak with Lorca alone. After the guards bowed and left, the prince, hesitating to say more, eventually turned and left. When only the 2 of them remained, the chief asked if Lorca intended to go up north. Lorca does not hide her intentions. She tells him that she wants to find Ashes first and then travel together to the city of Neverwinter. The chief did not respond to this but instead inquired about what would happen to their clan. Without hesitation, Lorca suggested that they should head up north too and settle there, avoiding further battles over resources and food. She looked at her father, knowing he must have considered this already, otherwise, he would not have refused the other clan's challenge. The chief remained silent, listening to Lorca speak. Lorca understood that her father was not one to admit defeat easily. Even against a formidable opponent, he would ensure they paid a price. Their position as the first clan for years was a testament to their spirit. Clearly, the chief was prepared to lead the clan away from their current home, rendering the sacred duels meaningless. He no longer wished to see his warriors sacrifice themselves for feudal conflicts. After a moment of silence, the chief smiled, wondering whether Lorca was naturally intelligent or just as sharp as a wolf. Turned out, Lorca was right. The chief had indeed been waiting for Lorca to wake up first and discuss relocation. Lorca shook her head, also her long pointy ears, while claiming she didn't understand those matters and was not naturally intelligent, as she only believed in the strength of her fists. The chief looked at her, puzzled. Lorca explained that fighting someone allowed her to understand what kind of person they were, using the combat skills that her father had taught her from a young age through personal combat training. Hence, she could guess her father's thoughts as well. The chief laughed heartily and then asked Lorca how she viewed Ashes. Recalling how Ashes had protected her. Hence, she could guess her father's thoughts as well. The chief laughed heartily and then asked Lorca how she viewed Ashes. Recalling how Ashes had protected her. Hence, she could guess her father's thoughts as well. The chief laughed heartily and then asked Lorca how she viewed Ashes. Recalling how Ashes had protected her, Lorca described her as someone who didn't talk much but a perfect guardian. Smiling at the thought, Lorca mused that anyone protected by Ashes must feel warm and secure. Hearing this, the chief finally made up his mind and decided to lead the clan up north in a few days. Lorca, however, planned to set off alone ahead of them. She wanted to see for herself if what was promised was true and if they really could have their own oasis. While Lorca trusted Ashes, she remained skeptical of others, even stating that if the king of Grey Castle deceived her, she would teach him a lesson. Oof, little girl, you sure about that? The chief, intrigued, asked what if everything they were told was true. Would Lorca pledge loyalty or serve? He even began to imagine his daughter married to the king of Grey Castle, causing Lorca to blush, her ears twitching and eyes involuntarily shifting away as she murmured that no one would fancy a half-human, half-beast creature. Well, I'm sure that Roland would love to pat you on the head. The chief chuckled and didn't press further on the topic. Instead, he asked Lorca to come closer. He wanted to take a good look at his daughter. As usual, Lorca approached and bowed down before him, and the chief affectionately patted her hair and fluffy ears and thanked her for all these years of sacrifice. During the night, having packed her belongings, Lorca left Iron Sand City with a huge backpack on her back. Entering the quiet and desolate desert, she looked around to ensure no one was around. Then, she set down her backpack and took off her clothes, folding each piece neatly into her backpack. Entering the quiet and desolate desert, she looked around to ensure no one was around. Then, she set down her backpack and took off her clothes, folding each piece neatly into her backpack. Entering the quiet and desolate desert, she looked around to ensure no one was around. Then, she set down her backpack and took off her clothes, folding each piece neatly into her backpack. Entering the quiet and desolate desert, she looked around to ensure no one was around. Then, she set down her backpack and took off her clothes, folding each piece neatly into her backpack. She then looked up at the moon, feeling the wind while transforming into a giant red wolf. She lifted her head and let out a satisfying howl. The heavy backpack, now held in her mouth, seemed very small. Moments later, she once again embarked on her journey up north.